December 1877, St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York. The winter sky hangs low and gray over Fifth Avenue, heavy with the promise of snow. 50,000 people line the streets, pressing against wooden barricades, climbing lampposts, perching in windows, ordinary workers, factory girls, newsboys, immigrants who crossed oceans for a chance. They remove their hats as the hearse passes, not out of respect for the man inside, but because they cannot believe he is truly gone. Cornelius Vanderbilt lies in a mahogany casket, draped in black velvet. At 79, he had wasted away in his mansion on Washington Place, refusing morphine, enduring the pain of failing organs with the same stubborn will that had built an empire. His son William walks behind the casket, face pale as marble, carrying a weight heavier than grief. But it is not the Vanderbilts who command attention now. Among the mourners stands Daniel Drew, Vanderbilt's old rival, his eyes wet with genuine tears. Men who had fought him in boardrooms, who had been crushed by his business wars, who had called him a pirate and a thief. They line the church steps, heads bowed. Drew whispers to no one, "He was the only king we had." Inside the cathedral, candles flicker against stained glass. The archbishop speaks of charity and humility, virtues the dead man never much admired. Cornelius Vanderbilt had no use for poetry or pretense. He could barely write his own name until middle age. He once said, "I don't care half so much about making money as I do about making my point and coming out ahead." But as the organ swells and the congregation weeps, something strange happens to the fortune he leaves behind. The newspapers call it the largest estate in American history, $100 million, more gold than existed in the entire United States Treasury. And yet, within 48 years, not a single Vanderbilt remains among the wealthiest Americans. Their name becomes a punchline, their palaces become museums, their bloodline becomes a lesson written in fading ink. To understand how the richest family in the world vanished into history, we must first understand the man who started with nothing and the children who inherited everything. This is the story of how an empire was built by one man's will and destroyed by his children's taste. The boy who would become the richest man in America was born on Staten Island in 1794 into a world that moved at the speed of wind and water. His father ferried passengers across the harbor in a two-masted periauger, a Dutch-designed workboat that smelled of fish and sweat and salt. Young Cornelius learned to read the sky before he learned to read books. The color of clouds at sunset, the way gulls flew when a storm approached, the precise moment to reef a sail before the wind turned murderous. He was a fierce, unlettered child with a temper like a struck bell. At 11, he quit school forever, unable to endure the humiliation of struggling through sentences while younger children recited easily. His teachers called him slow. His father called him useless. But on the water, something awakened in him, a feel for currents and tides that seemed almost supernatural, a willingness to work harder than any man twice his age, and a hunger that would never be satisfied. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a small sailing vessel. The terms were harsh. He would plow a plot of land for her as collateral and share half his profits. She knew her son well enough to demand security. He worked the field in exchange for the loan, then launched his boat into the Kill Van Kull with nothing but ambition and the memory of every insult ever thrown at him. The War of 1812 made him. When the British blockaded New York Harbor, most captains hid their vessels or sold them cheap. Vanderbilt saw opportunity. He obtained a government contract to supply forts along the Hudson, running his little boat through waters patrolled by British warships. At night, with no running lights, he slipped past the enemy, carrying provisions to starving garrisons. He learned that war was simply business conducted at gunpoint, and that courage could be converted into currency. By 25, he commanded a small fleet. By 30, he was a millionaire. By 40, he had destroyed every competitor who dared challenge him on the Hudson River, cutting fares until his rivals went bankrupt, then raising them again when he owned the route. His enemies called him ruthless. He called them inefficient. When one steamboat line sued him for unfair competition, Vanderbilt appeared in court with a simple defense. "I don't care anything about your laws. I've got the power." The judge fined him anyway. Vanderbilt paid it, then drove the line out of business within a year. But the Hudson was only practice. The real fortune lay in California. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1848, America went mad. Thousands of men abandoned their families, their farms, their futures, all for the chance to scoop glittering metal from the American river. The problem was getting there. Overland travel took months, through disease and starvation and hostile territory. The sea route around Cape Horn took even longer and killed nearly as many. Vanderbilt saw the map differently. If travelers could cross Nicaragua instead, taking a steamboat up the San Juan River, then a short carriage ride to the Pacific, they could cut the journey by weeks. Vanderbilt traveled to Central America himself, slogging through jungles thick with mosquitoes, negotiating with governments that changed leaders faster than he changed shirts. He secured exclusive rights to the route, built docks and roads and stations, and began ferrying fortune seekers from New York to San Francisco in record time. The gold rush made him a fortune, but the gold rush also taught him something more valuable, that controlling the path was better than controlling the destination. Every man who crossed Nicaragua paid Vanderbilt. Every ounce of gold shipped east paid Vanderbilt. He didn't need to dig in the earth when he could dig in the pockets of everyone who did. By 1853, he was wealthy enough to retire. He was 59 years old, worth $11 million, master of the greatest shipping empire on earth. His wife suggested they travel Europe, see the sights, enjoy the fruits of his labor. He agreed. They lasted 6 months. Vanderbilt found Europe intolerable. The old castles, the older families, the way everyone bowed to titled aristocrats who had never worked a day in their lives. He wrote home constantly, demanding reports from his captains, fretting over his business. In Paris, surrounded by art and elegance, he sat in his hotel room and calculated freight rates. In Rome, while his wife toured the Vatican, he studied maps of Mediterranean trade routes. He returned to New York with a single conclusion: retirement was slow death. He needed a new war. And he found one: the railroads. In 1863, at 69 years old, an age when most men were settled by the fire, watching their grandchildren grow, Cornelius Vanderbilt began buying stock in the Harlem Railroad. It was a broken, mismanaged line running north from New York City, its tracks rusting, its trains late, its stock trading at barely $9 a share. Wall Street laughed. The old Commodore had finally lost his mind. But Vanderbilt understood something the speculators didn't. The Harlem had one asset more valuable than any locomotive: the only rail franchise into Manhattan. Every train from New England, from Canada, from the entire eastern seaboard, if it wanted to reach the docks and warehouses of New York, it had to come through Harlem tracks. Vanderbilt bought quietly, patiently, accumulating shares, while the city's sharpest traders sold short, betting the stock would fall. Then he struck. He improved the service. He laid new track. He made the trains run on time. And when the city granted the Harlem permission to build a streetcar line down Broadway, the stock exploded upward. The short sellers, men who had bet against him, men like Daniel Drew and Jim Fisk, faced ruin. They rushed to cover their positions, buying shares at any price, and Vanderbilt sold at the top. He didn't just win, he destroyed. Daniel Drew, who had started as a cattle drover, who invented the phrase "watered stock" by feeding his cows salt before market so they'd drink and weigh more, Drew learned a lesson that day: never bet against the Commodore, not when he owns the board, the track, and the future. Vanderbilt next targeted the Hudson River Railroad, then the New York Central. By 1867, he controlled a continuous rail line from New York City to Buffalo. By 1869, he had merged them into the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, the first great corporate monopoly in American history. 450 miles of steel track, carrying freight and passengers from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. He was 75 years old. He had built the largest railroad empire in the world, and he had no idea what to do with it next. The problem with empire building is that it requires enemies. Without someone to crush, without some new territory to conquer, the conqueror turns inward and finds only silence. Cornelius Vanderbilt had spent 75 years fighting against poverty, against competitors, against anyone who doubted him. He had outlived all his rivals. He had buried his wife, Sophia, after 50 years of marriage, a marriage that produced 13 children and very little warmth. He had watched his eldest son, Cornelius Jr., die of disease during the war. He had disowned another son for marrying against his wishes. His remaining children feared him, which he mistook for respect. In 1869, he remarried a Mobile, Alabama woman named Frank Crawford, 30 years his junior, from a family ruined by the Civil War. His children were horrified. His new wife was the same age as his granddaughters, but Vanderbilt cared nothing for their opinions. He installed Frank in the Washington Place mansion, surrounded her with servants and jewels, and continued his routine of rising at dawn, reading the shipping news, and barking orders at subordinates who had long since stopped questioning him. But age was catching up. His hands trembled, his memory faltered. In board meetings, he sometimes forgot which railroad he was discussing. His son William, the overlooked son, the one he'd once dismissed as a dullard fit only for farming, had quietly taken over day-to-day operations, and William ran the railroads with a cold efficiency his father admired, even if he couldn't admit it. In 1873, Vanderbilt attended the opening of Grand Central Depot, his final great project, a massive train shed at 42nd Street that replaced the old open-air terminal downtown. He sat in a velvet chair while politicians praised him, while crowds cheered, while locomotives whistled in salute. He looked at the building and saw his name carved in stone, a monument that would outlast him. He was already dying. The last years were cruel. His body failed piece by piece, his eyesight, his hearing, his ability to walk. He sat in his mansion, surrounded by servants who spoke in whispers, visited by children who came only out of duty. Frank read to him from newspapers, from the Bible, from anything that might distract him from the pain. He spoke less and less. Sometimes he stared at the wall for hours, seeing something no one else could see. On January 4, 1877, he called for William. The old man's voice was barely a whisper. He said, "Keep the money together." William nodded. Cornelius Vanderbilt died that night, with Frank holding his hand and rain falling against the windows. The city barely waited for morning before the newspapers began speculating about his fortune. The will was read in the mansion on Washington Place, with the family gathered in the parlor like mourners at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Cornelius's children leaned forward, waiting to hear their portions, calculating their futures. His daughters had been married off to respectable men, some wealthy, some merely comfortable, and they expected to be provided for. His sons, the ones he hadn't disowned, expected to share control of the railroad. The lawyer unfolded the document. The room held its breath. Cornelius Vanderbilt left 95% of his fortune, roughly $90 million, to William. The other children received annual allowances, enough to live comfortably, but nothing like control, nothing like power. William's oldest son, Cornelius III, received a small trust. His other grandchildren received nothing at all. And Frank, his second wife, received the mansion on Washington Place, $200,000 in cash, and a portfolio of railroad stock that would make her independently wealthy for life. The parlor erupted. Cornelius Jeremiah, the Commodore's son, a frail, epileptic man whom his father had always despised, whom he'd once had committed to an insane asylum for his gambling debts, stood shaking with rage. "He hated me," Cornelius Jr. shouted. "He hated me from the day I was born." His sisters wept. Their husbands muttered about lawsuits. Only William sat silent, his face unreadable, holding the document that had just made him the richest man in America. The lawsuits came anyway. Cornelius Jeremiah sued to break the will, claiming his father had been insane in his final years, influenced by spiritualists, manipulated by Frank, no longer competent to manage his affairs. The trial became a sensation, filling newspapers with lurid details of the Commodore's final days, his reliance on mediums who claimed to contact his dead mother, his strange ramblings about spirits and voices. William fought back. He testified calmly, methodically, producing doctors who swore his father had been lucid until the end. He produced letters in the Commodore's own hand, written weeks before his death, discussing business with perfect clarity. He produced Frank, who described the old man's final hours with dignity and restraint. The jury took 4 hours to rule in William's favor. Cornelius Jeremiah left the courtroom a broken man. 4 years later, he checked into a hotel on Staten Island, wrote a note apologizing to his sisters, and shot himself in the head. The family buried him quietly next to his father in the Vanderbilt mausoleum on Staten Island. Too grave, two men who could never understand each other. William Vanderbilt inherited everything, and now he faced the question his father had never answered. What do you do with an empire when there's nothing left to conquer? William Vanderbilt stood at the window of his father's counting house on 4th Street, watching the ships slide down the East River, and understood for the first time what it meant to be truly alone. He was 56 years old, a grandfather many times over, master of the greatest fortune in American history, and he had never wanted any of it. His father had called him Billy well into adulthood, the diminutive carrying a sting that 40 years never dulled. When young William had asked for a position in the family business, the Commodore had sent him to Staten Island to farm, convinced the boy lacked the killer instinct. For 2 decades, William had risen before dawn to tend crops and livestock, watching from afar as his father built empires on water and steel. He married Maria Kissam, a minister's daughter, and raised 8 children in a simple farmhouse, far from the mansions and ballrooms of his siblings. Then the Commodore ran out of sons he trusted. The ones who had the instinct: Cornelius Jr., who drank himself through early manhood; George, who died in the war; the various half-brothers and cousins who tried and failed, all proved unworthy. Only William remained, steady and reliable and utterly underestimated. The Commodore called him home, set him to work on the railroads, and waited for him to fail. William never failed. He organized. He systematized. He took his father's chaotic genius and built structures around it, turning instinct into infrastructure, impulse into institution. The Commodore watched and grudgingly admired, and never quite forgave his son for proving him wrong. Now the old man was dead, and William carried the weight of an empire that felt more like a sentence than an inheritance. The first lesson William learned about being the richest man in America was that everyone wanted something. Morning brought a cascade of letters, requests for donations, investment opportunities, charitable appeals from organizations he'd never heard of. Men he'd considered friends suddenly appeared with business propositions carefully timed to seem casual. Women he'd never met sent notes hinting at dinners, introductions, accidental meetings in the park. His sisters still weren't speaking to him. Cornelius Jeremiah's suicide had left a stain on the family name that no amount of money could wash clean. The newspapers called William the millionaire miser and speculated endlessly about his personal fortune, his spending habits, his plans for the future. When he bought a modest house on 5th Avenue, the papers calculated its cost down to the last brick. When he donated to charity, they accused him of buying respectability. Maria, his wife of 40 years, watched it all with quiet anxiety. She had never wanted wealth. She had married a farmer, raised her children in simplicity, prayed nightly for their souls and their safety. Now she presided over a household she didn't recognize, servants who bowed and scraped, callers who praised her husband to his face and mocked him behind his back, children who had grown into adults she barely understood. Her eldest, Cornelius III, was 32 and already exhausted by life. He had served briefly in the war, married young, and now drifted through society without purpose or passion. Her daughters, Margaret, Emily, Florence, Eliza, had married into old families, carrying Vanderbilt money into aristocratic names that looked down on trade. Her youngest, William Jr., known as Willie, was 27 and already showing signs of the restlessness that would define his life. Maria saw the future in her children's eyes and did not like what she saw. In 1878, a year after his father's death, William Vanderbilt gave an interview that would define his public image forever. A reporter from the Chicago Daily News cornered him at the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, where William had gone to escape the heat and the demands of New York society. The reporter asked a simple question: why didn't Vanderbilt use more of his fortune to benefit the public? William paused. He was not a man given to philosophical reflection. He thought in ledgers and schedules, not in speeches and manifestos. But something in the reporter's tone, that assumption of entitlement, that implication that wealth carried obligations beyond the owner's choosing, struck a nerve. He answered, "The public be damned. I am working for my stockholders. If the public want the train, why don't they pay for it?" The reporter's pencil flew across the page. The next morning, the words appeared in newspapers across America, and William Vanderbilt became the most hated man in the country. He tried to explain, but explanations only made it worse. He meant that railroads were private property, not public utilities, that his duty was to investors, not passengers. But the public heard only the contempt, the dismissal, the echo of every rich man who had ever looked down on working people. Cartoonists drew him with dollar signs for eyes, crushing workers under iron wheels. Labor unions printed his words on handbills and passed them out at strikes. His name became shorthand for corporate greed, a symbol of everything wrong with the new industrial age. At home, Maria wept. His children cringed at dinner parties. His grandchildren came home from school in tears, mocked by classmates who repeated the phrase their parents used at supper tables across the city. William retreated deeper into his counting house, speaking only to his managers and his ledgers, convinced that the world had misunderstood him and equally convinced that explaining further was useless. He turned, instead, to the one thing that had never failed him: the railroads. The New York Central under William Vanderbilt became a machine of terrifying efficiency. He double-tracked main lines, replaced wooden bridges with iron, introduced standardized time schedules that revolutionized American travel. He fought rate wars with competitors and won through sheer scale, cutting prices until rivals bled, then raising them again when the field was clear. He bought coal mines to fuel his locomotives, timber forests to build his cars, steel mills to forge his rails. The empire integrated vertically, horizontally, in every direction at once. By 1880, the New York Central controlled more than 4,000 miles of track. Its trains carried wheat from Chicago, lumber from Michigan, cattle from Kansas, manufactured goods from New England factories. Its dividends made widows rich and orphans comfortable. Its stock was considered as safe as government bonds, its future as certain as sunrise. And yet William found no joy in it. He had always worked for his father's approval. Now there was no father, no approval to earn, no victory that meant anything beyond the numbers on a balance sheet. He built mansions for his children, settled fortunes on his daughters, established trusts for his grandchildren. He gave millions to charity quietly, without seeking credit. He funded a university in Nashville that would bear his name, Vanderbilt, as a monument to something, though he wasn't sure what. At night, he sat in his library with Maria, reading aloud from the Bible or from the novels she loved. They spoke of their children, their grandchildren, the small dramas of family life that had nothing to do with railroads or fortunes. These were the only hours he truly lived, the only moments when the weight of empire lifted from his shoulders. But his children were already planning their escape. The Vanderbilt children had grown up in the shadow of their grandfather's legend and their father's industry, and they wanted none of it. They had seen what the railroads did to men, the endless calculations, the sleepless nights, the suspicion that every handshake concealed a knife. They wanted something different: beauty, culture, society, the things money could buy that work could never touch. Cornelius III, the eldest, married Alice Gwynn, a Cincinnati girl with ambition to match any Vanderbilt. She looked at the family's brownstone on Fifth Avenue, at the simple furnishings and modest entertainments, and saw only embarrassment. The Astors had ballrooms, the Belmonts had art collections, the Vanderbilts had railroads, dirty, commercial, common. Alice began planning. William Jr., Willie, married Alva Smith, a Southern belle whose family had lost everything in the Civil War. Alva looked at the Vanderbilts and saw opportunity. She had grown up with nothing, survived on nothing, learned to fight with nothing. Now she had the richest name in America to wield like a weapon. She would not waste it. The daughters married into old money, the Whitneys, the Sloanes, the Tombleys, carrying Vanderbilt cash into families that had looked down on their grandfather as a common ferryman. They learned the ways of society, the endless rules of precedence and presentation, the subtle warfare of calling cards and dinner invitations. They discovered that being a Vanderbilt was both an asset and a liability. The money was welcome. The name still smelled of salt water and coal smoke. William watched his children drift away from him, into a world he didn't understand and didn't want to enter. They spoke of Paris fashions and London seasons, of art dealers and architects, of parties where the guest list mattered more than the conversation. He paid for it all, because that was what fathers did, and because saying no had never been part of his vocabulary. But he worried. He worried that they didn't understand what the money meant, where it came from, what it cost, how easily it could vanish. He tried to tell them about his father, about the $100 loan and the British blockade, about the years of sleeping on deck and eating salt pork. They listened politely, then returned to their guest lists. The money would last forever, they assumed. It had to. Their grandfather had built it too solidly, too massively, for anything to shake it. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street had been a cow pasture within living memory. Now, in the spring of 1881, it became a battlefield. Alva Vanderbilt stood at the edge of the excavation, watching her dream rise from the Manhattan schist. 40 feet below street level, hundreds of Italian immigrants labored with pick and shovel, carving a basement larger than most Manhattan houses. Above them, a forest of scaffolding marked the outline of what would become the most controversial building in New York, a French Renaissance chateau, complete with turrets and gargoyles, transplanted stone by stone from the Loire Valley to the heart of American commerce. The architect, Richard Morris Hunt, stood beside her, unrolling drawings that measured 6 feet across. He had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designed houses for the Astors and the Belmonts, and still found himself intimidated by this small woman with the Alabama accent and the eyes that missed nothing. "The limestone comes from Caen," he explained, pointing to the renderings. "Same quarry that supplied the Louvre. We'll bring it over as ballast in empty grain ships, cheaper than paying for cargo." Alva nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She calculated the height of the turrets against the Astor mansion 2 blocks south. She measured the width of the entrance against the Belmont house on the corner. She imagined the ballroom, her ballroom, filled with the 400 families who constituted New York society, the families who had never invited a Vanderbilt to their tables, who still referred to her husband's fortune as new money, with a curl of the lip that spoke centuries. Let them curl, she thought. Let them watch from their brownstones while this chateau rises. Let them wonder what comes next. What came next was war. The war had a name: Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. William Astor, the Mrs. Astor, as she insisted on being called, ruled New York society from her brownstone at 355th Avenue with an authority that no Vanderbilts, no railroads, no amount of money could challenge. Her family had owned Manhattan when it was still farmland. Her father had been a descendant of the first Dutch settlers. Her husband's name meant fur trading and real estate, commerce conducted in the previous century, when America was still young enough to remember its own birth. She kept a list, the famous 400, the number of people who could fit in her ballroom, and therefore the exact number of people who mattered in New York society. No one entered her circle without her approval. No one gave a ball without her attendance. No one married well, dined well, or died well without her acknowledgement. The Vanderbilts were not on the list. Alva studied the list obsessively, memorizing names and connections, tracing the invisible threads of marriage and money that bound old New York together. She learned that the Astors never invited anyone to dinner without first checking their pedigree. She learned that the Schermerhorns, Mrs. Astor's family, intermarried with the Rhinelanders, who intermarried with the Joneses, creating a web so dense that no outsider could penetrate it. She learned, too, that the web had weaknesses. The old families had money, yes, but not Vanderbilt money. The Astors were worth perhaps $8 million, a fortune certainly, but a fraction of what William Vanderbilt controlled. The Schermerhorns had land, but land didn't generate dividends. The Rhinelanders had position, but position didn't build railroads or move wheat across continents. Alva saw her opening. Money couldn't buy entry into society, but money could build a ballroom so magnificent that society would have no choice but to attend. The Petit Chateau, as the newspapers called it, cost $3 million. Its facade featured carved saints and mythical beasts. Its interior boasted ceilings shipped from European palaces. Its ballroom could hold 600 guests, 200 more than Mrs. Astor's. When it was finished in 1883, Alva announced a costume ball to celebrate its opening. The invitations went out in March, engraved on heavy cream stock, each one hand-delivered by uniformed footmen. The 400 held their breath. Would anyone attend? Mrs. Astor faced a dilemma. Her daughter, Carrie, had received an invitation. If the Astors declined, Carrie would miss the most anticipated social event of the decade, and worse, the Vanderbilts might never forgive the slight. If they accepted, Mrs. Astor would have to acknowledge that the old order had changed, that money could indeed buy what birth had once guaranteed. She sent word to Alva. She would attend, but only if Alva called upon her first. A ritual submission, the newcomer paying respects to the Queen. Alva refused. The standoff lasted 3 weeks. New York society divided into factions, with dowagers taking sides and younger generations waiting breathlessly for resolution. Mrs. Astor sat in her brownstone, receiving callers who reported every Vanderbilt move. Alva sat in her chateau, going over guest lists and seating charts, outwardly calm and inwardly raging. Then Carrie Astor made her move. She had met Willie Vanderbilt at a charity event, had danced with him twice, had found him charming in his quiet way. She wanted to attend the ball more than she had ever wanted anything, wanted to see the chateau, wanted to wear her new Worth gown, wanted to be part of the story that everyone would tell for years. She begged her mother to relent. Mrs. Astor looked at her daughter, her only daughter, her favorite child, and saw something she had never expected to see, the future, arriving whether she welcomed it or not. On the last Monday in March, Carolina Store's carriage stopped before the Vanderbilt chateau. She climbed the steps, presented her card to the butler, and waited in the marble foyer while word was sent upstairs. Alva took her time. When she finally descended, she found Mrs. Astor standing exactly where she had been left, not a flicker of impatience crossing her face. The two women regarded each other. Mrs. Astor, 53 years old, her dark hair streaked with gray, her gown 10 years out of fashion, because fashion was for those who needed to prove something. Alva, 30, radiant in silk, every detail perfect, every hair in place. "Mrs. Vanderbilt," said Mrs. Astor, "how lovely to meet you at last." "Mrs. Astor," Alva replied, "how kind of you to call." They spoke for exactly 20 minutes. About the weather, about the chateau's architecture, about nothing at all. When Mrs. Astor left, she carried with her an invitation to the ball, written in Alva's own hand, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. William Astor and Miss Carrie Astor. The war was over. The Vanderbilts had won. The ball itself became legend. On the night of March 26, 1883, Fifth Avenue filled with carriages for blocks in every direction. Police had been stationed to control the crowds, ordinary New Yorkers who pressed against the barriers, hoping to glimpse the costumes, the jewels, the sheer impossibility of what waited inside the chateau. Gaslight flickered along the facade, illuminating the carved saints and mythical beasts, making them seem almost alive. Inside, Alva had transformed her house into a vision of the past. She herself appeared as a Venetian princess, her gown sewn with real pearls, a diamond star in her hair. Willie came as a French courtier, uncomfortable in silk stockings, but willing to endure anything for his wife's happiness. Carrie Astor arrived as a Danish milkmaid, deliberately simple, deliberately charming, a peace offering wrapped in muslin. The costumes grew more elaborate as the night progressed. Mrs. Astor wore diamonds that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, or so she claimed, and no one dared dispute her. The Belmonts came as Renaissance nobles, the Rhinelanders as medieval knights, the Joneses as characters from Shakespeare. A prince of the blood, visiting from France, appeared in authentic armor that required 2 servants to help him sit. Supper was served at midnight. Terrapin, oysters, quail, champagne flowing like water. The orchestra played until 4 in the morning. When the last guests finally departed, they carried with them memories that would be retold for decades. The night the Vanderbilts arrived, the night old New York surrendered to new money, the night when Alva Vanderbilt proved that a chateau could be worth more than a pedigree. The newspapers estimated the cost at $250,000, more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. The figure was probably exaggerated, but no one bothered to correct it. The point was not the cost, but the effect. The Vanderbilts had arrived, and they would never leave. Except that Alva was already planning her next move. Newport, Rhode Island in the 1880s was summer headquarters for the 400. The old families had built cottages there, modest by Manhattan standards, though modest meant 30 rooms and a stable, where they escaped the heat and disease of the city from June through September. They sailed, they played tennis, they gave dinners that stretched into the night, and they watched each other with the same hungry attention they gave to everything. The Vanderbilts had been summering in Newport for years, renting cottages while they searched for the perfect property. In 1885, Alva found it, a rocky promontory overlooking the Atlantic, with nothing between her and Europe except 3,000 miles of open ocean. She bought it for $50,000 and commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to build something that would make the petty chateau look like a practice sketch. The Breakers, they called it. The name came from the waves that crashed against the rocks below, sending spray high enough to mist the windows on stormy days. Hunt designed an Italian Renaissance palazzo, 70 rooms spread over 5 floors, with a central hall that rose 50 feet to a ceiling painted with clouds and cherubs. The bedrooms had bedrooms. The bathrooms had marble floors. The kitchen occupied its own wing, connected to the dining room by an underground tunnel so servants could move unseen. Cost was never discussed. Willie Vanderbilt had inherited his father's fortune and his grandfather's railroads, and the money flowed like water. If Alva wanted gold leaf, she got gold leaf. If she wanted rare marbles from Africa, they were shipped. If she wanted a fireplace that had once warmed a French king, agents were dispatched to find it. The Breakers opened in 1895, a decade after construction began. By then, Alva had divorced Willie, a scandal that shook society to its foundations, that made the 400 choose sides, that proved even Vanderbilt money couldn't buy happiness. She had taken a lover, then a husband, then a new name and a new life. Willie kept the breakers, visited it rarely, and died 5 years later of a heart attack, alone in Paris at the age of 55. But the palaces remain. The Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, the breakers in Newport, the various mansions scattered across New York and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. They stood as monuments to an idea that money could buy permanence, that fortunes built on railroads could be converted into stone and steel and memory. The Vanderbilts believed this. They believed that their grandfather's labor, their father's industry, their own relentless spending would somehow preserve the family name forever. They did not yet understand that palaces, once built, must be maintained, that fortunes once spent do not return, that empires once divided rarely reunite. The seeds of destruction had already been planted. They were about to sprout. The night Consuelo Vanderbilt learned she would marry a duke, she wept until dawn. She was 18 years old, tall and slender, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's fierce intelligence. She had spent the spring of 1895 doing what girls of her class did, attending parties, receiving callers, practicing piano, dreaming of a future she could not yet imagine. A young man had begun to visit, a handsome American named Winthrop Rutherford, who spoke to her of books and music and the world beyond New York. She believed herself in love. Alva believed otherwise. She summoned Consuelo to her sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon, the curtains drawn against the spring light. The room smelled of lilies and furniture polish, and Consuelo felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied these private audiences with her mother. Alva did not waste time on pleasantries. "You will marry the Duke of Marlborough," she said. Consuelo stared at her. "I don't know any duke." "Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. He is visiting America to seek a wife, and he has expressed interest in our family. The wedding will take place in the fall." The words fell like stones. Consuelo thought of Winthrop, of his letters hidden in her desk drawer, of the future they had whispered about during dances when no one was watching. She opened her mouth to protest. Alva raised one hand. "There is nothing to discuss. This marriage will secure our family's position for generations. The Marlboroughs have been dukes since the time of Queen Anne. They own Blenheim Palace, one of the great houses of England. You will be a duchess. Your children will be lords and ladies. This is not a request." Consuelo fled to her room and wrote to Winthrop. His reply came the next day. He would come for her, would rescue her, would defy her mother and the world itself for love. But he was 29, with no fortune of his own, and Alva Vanderbilt was not a woman who could be defied by anyone, least of all a lovesick girl and a penniless suitor. The battle lines were drawn. Only one side could win. Alva understood something that her daughter could not. In the world she had fought so hard to enter, love was a luxury, not a right. She herself had married Willie Vanderbilt for position, not passion, and when passion later appeared, in the form of Oliver Belmont, she had paid for it with scandal and divorce. But she had learned. She knew that a woman's value was measured by the man she married, and that a Vanderbilt girl could either marry well or marry for love, not both. The Duke of Marlborough, sunny to his friends, though his manner suggested otherwise, arrived in New York that summer with his mother, the Duchess of Marlborough, and a retinue of servants that filled an entire floor of the Waldorf Astoria. He was 23, with pale blue eyes and a manner so aristocratic it bordered on parody. He examined Consuelo as he might examine a racehorse, her teeth, her carriage, her prospects. He found her satisfactory. His mother was more direct. The Marlboroughs had lost most of their fortune maintaining Blenheim Palace, that vast monument to English glory that swallowed money faster than coal mines produced it. They needed American cash to prop up English stones. They had come shopping. Alva entertained them at the breakers, where the ocean views and the marble halls and the endless parade of servants demonstrated exactly what the Marlboroughs needed to see, that this family could afford a dukedom. She seated Consuelo next to Sonny at every meal, arranged walks along the cliffs, created opportunities for conversation that Consuelo endured in silence. Winthrop Rutherford, meanwhile, had not given up. He sent letters through servants, arranged meetings in discreet locations, promised Consuelo a life of simple happiness, far from the pressures of mothers and dukes and social ambition. They met once in Newport, hidden among the rocks below the cliff walk, and held each other while the waves crashed around them. "I will wait forever," he whispered. "I will never marry him," she promised. But promises made by 18-year-olds are fragile things. Alva had not raised her daughter to be weak. She had raised her to be strong, strong enough to endure what must be endured, to sacrifice what must be sacrificed, to understand that the individual meant nothing against the family's survival. When Consuelo still refused, Alva played her final card. The doctor arrived at the breakers on a grey August morning, carrying his leather bag and his carefully prepared diagnosis. He examined Consuelo in her bedroom, pulse, temperature, the endless questions about headaches and nerves, while Alva waited in the hall like a sentinel. When he emerged, his face arranged in professional sympathy, he delivered his verdict. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, I regret to inform you that your daughter is suffering from a nervous condition. Her heart is weak. The strain of refusal, of prolonged engagement, could prove dangerous." Consuelo heard the words through the door and understood immediately. Her mother had bought him. The diagnosis was a lie, the danger imaginary, the weak heart nothing but a fiction designed to break her will. She ran to the window, pressed her forehead against the cool glass, and watched the Atlantic roll endlessly toward England. That afternoon, Alva came to her room. She did not sit, she did not soften her voice. She stood at the foot of the bed and delivered the final argument, the one that could not be refuted. "If you refuse the Duke," Alva said, "your father will cut you off. You will have nothing, no money, no home, no future. Winthrop Rutherford cannot support you. He has his own family to consider, his own position to maintain. He will not choose you over everything he possesses. Men do not." Consuelo wanted to argue, but the words would not come. She knew her mother was right. She knew that Winthrop's letters, passionate as they were, did not include plans for elopement, offers of marriage, any concrete promise beyond vague declarations of devotion. She knew that she was alone. "Your duty," Alva continued, "is to your family. Your grandfather built this fortune so that his descendants could rise. Your father has maintained it so that you could have choices. This is the choice. You can be a duchess or you can be nothing. Decide." Consuelo looked at her mother, at this small, fierce woman who had climbed from southern poverty to the pinnacle of New York society, who had built palaces and crushed enemies, who had divorced her husband and kept his money, who had never lost a battle in her life. She saw in Alva's eyes something she had never noticed before, not cruelty but fear. The fear of falling, the fear of losing everything her generation had gained, the fear that one wrong marriage could undo 50 years of struggle. "I will marry him," Consuelo whispered. Alva nodded once, turned, and left the room. Wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue. The New York Times devoted 8 pages to its description, calling it the most brilliant social event in the history of American society. 4,000 guests filled the church, spilling into the streets, where crowds gathered to watch the carriages arrive. Police held back the masses, while Vanderbilts and Marlboroughs, Astors and Belmonts, the entire 400 processed into the sanctuary. Consuelo walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Willie Vanderbilt, 56 years old, already showing the strain that would kill him within 4 years, moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step cost him something. He had opposed this marriage, had fought Alva behind closed doors, had tried to protect his daughter from her mother's ambition, but in the end he had surrendered, as he always surrendered to Alva. Now he gave his daughter away, and the weight of it showed in his face. The bride wore ivory satin, trimmed with Brussels lace that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, or so the papers claimed. Her train extended 15 feet behind her, carried by 8 bridesmaids in white velvet. Her veil was held in place by a diamond tiara that had cost more than most American homes. She looked, the papers agreed, like a princess from a fairy tale. No one noticed that she never smiled. The Duke stood at the altar in the uniform of the Oxfordshire Yeomanry, blue and gold and scarlet, a sword at his side. He watched his bride approach and saw only what she represented: money, security, the preservation of Blenheim, the continuation of his line. He had been raised to understand marriage as transaction, love as irrelevant, duty as everything. He had found a partner who understood the same lesson. The service lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Consuelo Vanderbilt was no longer an American heiress. She was Her Grace the Duchess of Marlborough, mistress of Blenheim Palace, chatelaine of one of England's greatest houses. She had gained a title and lost everything else. At the reception, held in the Vanderbilt Chateau on Fifth Avenue, Winthrop Rutherford stood in the crowd and watched her move among her guests. She passed within 10 feet of him, close enough to touch, close enough to speak. Their eyes met for a single moment, then she turned away. He left before the dancing began. Blenheim Palace in winter, was a monument to cold. Consuelo arrived in December, crossing the channel in a storm that left her retching into a basin, then traveling by train through the Oxfordshire countryside under skies the color of lead. The palace rose from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, enormous, ancient, indifferent to human presence. It had 300 rooms, 50 chimneys, and no central heating. Her new home defeated her from the first moment. The Duchess of Marlborough, the Dowager, her mother-in-law, met her at the door with an inspection that missed nothing. She examined Consuelo's gown, her gloves, her luggage, the servants who accompanied her. She offered no embrace, no welcome, only a series of instructions delivered in the flat tones of someone addressing a housemaid. You will find the house cold. We do not waste coal on unused rooms. Breakfast is at 8, served in the morning room. You will dress for dinner at 7. His Grace prefers punctuality. The palace swallowed Consuelo whole. She wandered corridors lined with portraits of dead Marlboroughs, ancestors who stared down at her with the same pale blue eyes as her husband. She sat in rooms so vast that her presence barely disturbed the silence. She ate meals at tables designed for 40, attended by footmen who moved like ghosts, while her husband read newspapers and said nothing. Sonny the Duke revealed himself slowly, and each revelation was worse than the last. He had married her for money, yes, but he also resented her for having it. He complained that her dowry was insufficient, that her family was vulgar, that America had produced nothing of value except cash. He demanded she convert to his religion, adopt his politics, abandon every connection to her former life. When she resisted, he withdrew into silence that could last for days. Consuelo wrote letters to her mother, describing the palace, the servants, the endless social obligations. She did not describe her loneliness. She did not describe the nights she lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed, wondering if Winthrop ever thought of her. She did not describe the moment she realized that she would never be happy again. Alva wrote back with instructions: entertain properly, produce an heir, secure your position. The rest will follow. The heir arrived in 1897, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, Marquis of Blandford, future 10th Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo held her son and felt something she had not expected: love, fierce and protective, the first genuine emotion she had experienced since leaving America. She would raise this child differently. She would teach him that love mattered, that duty was not everything, that money and titles meant nothing compared to the human heart. She did not yet know that her son would grow up to despise her. The marriage lasted 11 years. 11 years of cold rooms and colder silences, of public duties performed with perfect grace and private anguish hidden behind closed doors. 11 years of producing heirs, hosting dignitaries, maintaining the fiction that an American heiress and an English duke could find happiness together. 11 years of dying by inches. In 1906, Consuelo left. The divorce proceedings were conducted quietly, out of public view, with lawyers negotiating terms that would preserve everyone's dignity. The Duke received a financial settlement that secured Blenheim for another generation. Consuelo received custody of their sons, though the boys would spend most of their time in England, being raised as English aristocrats. Both parties issued statements about mutual respect and continuing friendship. Neither believed a word. Consuelo returned to America and found her mother waiting. Alva had aged. She was 53 now, her hair gray, her figure thickened, but her eyes held the same fierce intelligence that had built chateaus and crushed enemies. She looked at her daughter, this woman who had survived 11 years of marriage to a man she never loved, and said something Consuelo had waited her whole life to hear. "I was wrong," Alva said. "I should not have forced you. I thought I was protecting you, securing your future, doing what mothers must do. I was wrong." Consuelo stood in her mother's parlor, wearing the clothes of a woman who had been a duchess and was now nothing in particular, and felt tears she had not shed in years. She did not forgive Alva, not then, not ever completely, but she understood something she had not understood before, that her mother had acted from love, twisted and misdirected, but love nonetheless. The same love that had driven Alva to build palaces and wage social wars. The same love that had made her sacrifice her daughter to ambition. The same love that now admitted failure. They stood together in the fading light, mother and daughter, and for the first time in their lives, they looked at each other without pretense. Consuelo married again, Jacques Bolson, a French aviator and textile heir, a man she chose for herself, a man who made her happy. They lived in France and Florida, traveled the world, grew old together in a way that the Duke could never have permitted. She outlived him by decades, dying in 1964 at the age of 87, a woman who had been a duchess and found it wanting, who had learned that titles meant nothing and love meant everything. But the damage was done. The Vanderbilt fortune had crossed the Atlantic, had bought a dukedom, had secured a place in English history. The transaction cost millions, the dowry, the settlements, the endless maintenance of two households on opposite sides of the ocean, and it established a pattern that would repeat across the family. Money spent to buy status, status that produced nothing, money that never returned. The dowry was paid, the title was purchased, and the empire grew weaker with every generation. The party at the Vanderbilt Hotel in 1919 should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like a wake. The hotel itself was a monument to family ambition. 33 stories of Beaux-Arts grandeur at Park Avenue and 34th Street, built by Cornelius III as a testament to Vanderbilt endurance. It cost $9 million, employed 600 staff, and featured a ballroom that could accommodate 2,000 guests. Cornelius III had intended it as his legacy, proof that the family name meant something beyond railroads and palaces. But on this spring evening, as champagne flowed and orchestras played, the whispers ran through the crowd like currents through water. Alfred Vanderbilt, Cornelius III's younger brother, had gone down with the Lusitania 4 years earlier, drowning in the icy Atlantic when a German torpedo shattered the great liner. His body was never found. His fortune, $30 million, passed to his son, who was 6 years old and already showing signs of the restlessness that would consume him. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Alfred's sister, stood apart from the dancers, nursing a glass she barely touched. She had built her own life, a studio in Greenwich Village, a collection of modern art that critics mocked, a determination to be something more than a Vanderbilt heiress. She watched her cousins whirl past, these men and women who had inherited everything and built nothing, and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. They were the last generation. She could feel it the way sailors feel a change in the wind. The money was still there, millions upon millions, invested and reinvested, generating income that most Americans could not imagine. But the will to preserve it, the hunger that had driven her grandfather and great-grandfather, had evaporated like morning fog. The party ended at dawn. Cornelius III stood at the hotel entrance, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, pretending not to notice that his cousins were already spending next year's dividends. When the last guest departed, he walked through his empty ballroom, listening to his footsteps echo off marble walls, and wondered what his grandfather would think if he could see them now. He already knew the answer. The reckoning arrived in the form of a magazine article. In 1925, Fortune magazine, barely a year old, still finding its voice, published a feature on the Vanderbilt family. The title read simply, "The Vanderbilts." The content was devastating. The magazine calculated that Cornelius Vanderbilt's original fortune of $100 million, if simply left in government bonds, would by then have been worth nearly $2 billion. Instead, the family's collective wealth had dwindled to something like $30 million, divided among more than 80 descendants, each living off interest and principal, none adding anything substantial to the whole. The article described the mansions that dotted Fifth Avenue like tombstones, most of them empty now, the families having fled to apartments and country estates that cost less to maintain. It described the divorces that had become a family tradition, the lawsuits that consumed energy better spent on enterprise, the endless procession of heirs who had never worked a day and never intended to start. It described, with clinical precision, how the greatest fortune in American history had been systematically dismantled by the very people who inherited it. The family howled in protest. Lawyers wrote letters threatening lawsuits. Publicists arranged interviews to refute the numbers. But no one could deny the essential truth. The Vanderbilts had become a cautionary tale, not a success story. Their name, which had once meant railroads and empires, now meant nothing but faded glory. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney read the article in her studio, surrounded by paintings that would one day hang in the museum she was planning, a museum for American art, for the artists the establishment ignored, for the visionaries who built something new. She had used her fortune to support others, to create something that would outlast her. The magazine did not mention that. It mentioned only the parties, the palaces, the slow dissolution of wealth. She set the article aside and returned to her work. There was nothing else to do. By 1940, the The palaces were falling. The petty chateau on Fifth Avenue, Alva's masterpiece, the scene of that legendary ball, the fortress from which she had conquered New York society, came down first. The wrecking balls arrived in March, swinging through carved stone and marble halls as if through ordinary brick. Crowds gathered to watch, just as they had gathered to watch the carriages arrive 57 years earlier. But now they came to see destruction, not creation. The neighborhood had changed. Fifth Avenue was no longer a street of private mansions. It had become a canyon of apartments and shops, of commerce replacing residence, of the rich moving higher and higher above the street. The petty chateau stood in the way of progress, and progress demanded its removal. Demolition crews worked for months, reducing Alva's dream to rubble, then hauling the rubble away to become landfill somewhere in New Jersey. The breakers followed, though more slowly. Willie Vanderbilt's great palace survived the war years, maintained by a skeleton staff, opened occasionally for charity events that raised money for causes no one remembered. But the taxes mounted, the maintenance costs spiraled, and the family, scattered now across America and Europe, could not agree on what to do with it. Finally, in 1948, the Preservation Society of Newport County stepped forward. They offered to buy the breakers for a fraction of its worth, to maintain it as a museum, to keep the Vanderbilts' name alive in stone and memory. The family accepted. There was no other choice. Gertrude attended the opening ceremony, standing in the great hall where her mother had once entertained princes and dukes. The house was exactly as she remembered, the same marbles, the same gilding, the same ceilings painted with clouds and cherubs, but the life had gone out of it. It was a tomb now, a monument to something dead, visited by tourists who whispered and pointed and tried to imagine what it must have been like. She left early, before the speeches ended. She could not bear to hear strangers praise her family's taste when they should have been mourning her family's passing. The last Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, the Triple Palace at 64642, built by William Vanderbilt for himself and his daughters, survived until 1945. Then it, too, fell to the wreckers. By then, the family had scattered so widely that no one noticed. Cornelius III had died in 1942, a sad old man who had outlived his brothers, his sisters, his own sense of purpose. His son, Cornelius IV, had become a writer, a good one, respected by critics, but he wrote under a pseudonym, as if ashamed of the name he carried. His daughter, Grace, had married and divorced and married again, living quietly in Connecticut, far from the society columns that had once tracked her every movement. Gertrude's museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, opened in 1931 on West 8th Street, then moved to a larger building on West 54th, then to its current home on Madison Avenue. It thrived, grew, became an institution, but it bore her name, not Vanderbilt's. She had chosen that deliberately, separating herself from the family legacy even as she preserved her own. The others vanished into the crowd of wealthy Americans, indistinguishable from the rich families who had replaced them. They married Rockefellers and Harrimans and DuPonts, merging their diminished fortunes with names that still meant something. They moved to California and Europe, places where no one remembered the Commodore or his railroad. They became doctors and lawyers and farmers, ordinary professions, ordinary lives, the very ordinariness their ancestors had spent fortunes to escape. In 1953, when Gloria Vanderbilt, great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore, appeared on the cover of Life magazine, it was not because of her family name. It was because she had been at the center of a custody battle so sensational that it made headlines around the world. Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, and her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, had fought for years over the little girl, dragging the family's dirty laundry through every newspaper in America. The fortune that remained, a few million, carefully protected in trusts, became the prize. Gloria grew up to be an actress, a designer, a celebrity in her own right. She made her own money, spent her own money, lived her own life. The Vanderbilt name was a brand now, nothing more, something to be marketed, not inherited. The final reckoning came in 1973, almost a century after the Commodore's death. Anderson Cooper was 6 years old, playing in his mother's apartment on Park Avenue, when his grandfather, the last of the old-line Vanderbilts, the one who still remembered what the name had once meant, came to visit. Wyatt Cooper, Anderson's father, was a writer from Mississippi, charming and ambitious, still adjusting to the strange world he had married into. Gloria Vanderbilt, Anderson's mother, moved through the apartment like a woman who had spent her whole life being watched. The old man, Reginald Vanderbilt's son, though Reginald had died when Gloria was a baby, sat in the living room and looked at his grandnephew with eyes that had seen too much. He was the last generation raised on Vanderbilt money, the last to remember the mansions and the parties, the last to feel the weight of the name as something more than a curiosity. He did not speak of railroads. He did not speak of fortunes. He spoke of the family's summer house in Newport, long since sold, long since converted into a museum. He spoke of his grandmother, Alice Vanderbilt, who had lived to be 99 and had seen everything built and everything dismantled. He spoke of the past as if it were a country he had visited once, long ago, and could never return to. Anderson listened, too young to understand, too young to know that he would one day become a journalist, would one day tell his family's story to millions of viewers, would one day be asked again and again what it meant to be a Vanderbilt. He would answer honestly, it meant nothing. It meant a name on a trust fund that had long since run dry. It meant a history he had never lived, a legacy he had never inherited, a fortune that had evaporated before he was born. The old man left at sunset. Anderson watched him go, this stranger who shared his blood, and returned to his toys. The Vanderbilts were already ghosts to him, figures in photographs, names in books, stories his mother told on winter evenings when the city grew dark and quiet. They had nothing to do with his life, his future, the man he would become. He was right, they didn't. The statue still stands at the entrance to Grand Central Terminal, looking south down Park Avenue toward the financial district where the Commodore made his fortune. Cornelius Vanderbilt, carved in bronze, larger than life, one hand resting on his hip, the other gesturing toward something only he can see. Commuters rush past him every day, thousands of them, few pausing to read the inscription at his feet. He built the railroad that made this station necessary. He created the fortune that built these streets. He rose from nothing and became everything, and then his children gave it all away. The terminal itself survives, restored now to something like its original glory. The marble floors shine. The celestial ceiling, darkened by decades of cigarette smoke, has been cleaned to reveal the stars as they appeared in 1913. Trains still depart for upstate New York and New England, carrying passengers who have never heard of the Commodore, who ride on tracks he laid, who benefit from systems he created. But the family is gone. The mansions are museums. The fortune is scattered across 1,000 bank accounts, 1,000 trusts, 1,000 descendants who carry the blood but not the hunger. The name appears in history books and documentaries, a cautionary tale for every generation that forgets how easily money can vanish. The last Vanderbilt to live as a Vanderbilt, the last to carry the name and the fortune and the weight, died in 2019. Gloria Vanderbilt was 95 years old, a woman who had been a child in a sensational custody trial, a teenager escaping her family's shadow, an adult building a life on her own terms. She had outlived her parents, her husbands, her cousins, her fortune. She had watched her son become famous for reasons that had nothing to do with family name. At her funeral, Anderson Cooper spoke. He stood before the small gathering, family, friends, those who had known her best, and told stories of his mother. He spoke of her resilience, her creativity, her refusal to be defined by the name she carried. He did not mention the Commodore. He did not mention the railroad. He did not mention the fortune that had built and destroyed his family in equal measure. It was perhaps the most Vanderbilt thing of all, the last member of the family to bear the name, mourned by a son who carried a different one, surrounded by people who loved her for herself, not for her blood. The empire that Cornelius Vanderbilt built with sweat and steel and an unbreakable will had finally ended, not with a crash, but with a whisper. Outside the church, the city roared on, trains ran, markets traded, fortunes were made and lost and made again. The Commodore's statue faced south, toward the money, toward the future, toward everything he had built and everything his children had squandered. And high above Park Avenue, the stars on Grand Central's ceiling continued their slow celestial circle, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding below, indifferent to the rise and fall, the glory and the ruin, the empire that lasted one lifetime and the name that lasted barely more. The Vanderbilts were gone, but the trains still ran on time.